Of course, thank you so much for the introduction, Ron. I'm happy to be speaking at AngelBeat today. My name is Deanna Cook. I am a sustainability project manager here at ADEC Innovations on our ESG solutions team. We have a number of different businesses within the ADEC umbrella, but my team focuses exclusively on ESG. So happy to be speaking about just one small piece of that today with you with regard to the topic of decarbonization and how you can think about decarbonization, incorporating that into your company's broader ESG strategy. All right. So the sustainability journey of any company is an iterative, ongoing process. It's a journey, not a destination, but this may begin with data collection and analysis, move to a planning and strategy phase, and then you get into implementation, where you are tracking and automating your programs and initiatives and reporting out on the progress that you're making. Within the ADEC ESG team, we split our work into a number of different pillars. We do work in ESG data collection and data management, looking at data quality assessments, data stewardship, automation. This dovetails nicely with our ESG metrics and monitoring team, which is responsible for conducting greenhouse gas inventories, looking at scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, developing science-based targets, setting other types of targets, KPI design and development, developing the dashboards and monitoring systems that you might use to measure progress against those targets. We have our disclosure and reporting team, which really looks at both your company-led reports, what you might publish as an annual ESG, CSR, sustainability report, that could be developed in alignment with GRI, SASB, etc., as well as external reporting to frameworks and standards. CDP is one of a big services of ours, supporting company on their CDP responses. And finally, we have the corporate strategy and implementation team, which is the team that I predominantly sit on. We do work in materiality assessments, baseline assessments, risk assessments, looking at decarbonization and net zero planning, which I'll be discussing today, TCFD, broader ESG policy and program development. But all of these pillars really work hand in hand. Any given project with an organization could span multiple areas, and there's a lot of synergies that we can find when kind of aligning on these different areas. So to dive into our conversation today about decarbonization, first, I wanted to provide some additional context on decarbonization to make sure we are all aligned. So on the terminology, decarbonization can be described as the process through which a business, a government, another entity reduces its carbon footprint to improve its overall impact on the climate. Now, its carbon footprint is typically a measure of the greenhouse gas emissions expressed as the unit carbon dioxide equivalent. Net zero can often be seen as the ultimate goal of a decarbonization process. And it describes the state in which the total greenhouse gases emitted are balanced out by the total removed from the atmosphere. It can be achieved through a combination of emission mitigation measures, like installing solar panels or minimizing your business travel, and emission removal measures, such as reforestation or biochar. Now, a brief note on carbon offsets. Most people are familiar with the term carbon offsets, and it's used rather informally in the media and in daily conversation, but there are actually different types, different categories, and different qualities of offsets. So any offsets that are emission avoidance, such as funding a third-party project that is outside of your company's own value chain, like a clean cook stove project in the global south that is avoiding the burning of non-sustainable fuels. That's actually not allowed to be counted towards your net zero strategy as per the guidance by all of the major standards. Emission removal, however, is allowed in a net zero strategy. So emission removal, some examples that I mentioned previously were reforestation and biochar. That would be on the natural side. On the technical side, you see things like direct air capture, enhanced mineralization, ocean-based methods, etc. Carbon offsets can be a part of the decarbonization process, but the bulk of the work, of your work, should really be focused on emission mitigation. So that is where ADEC specializes and focuses our work, and where I'll be largely speaking about today. Now that we've understood and aligned on some of the context, I wanted to speak about some of the drivers of corporate decarbonization. Why is decarbonization so topical for companies right now? And why do we hear so much about it in the ESG world? We see typically three main drivers with our clients. The first being the market. So major companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Target have their own emission reduction or net zero targets. And as part of that, they push decarbonization requirements along to their vendors and suppliers, companies that may be representing the scope 3 emissions of Microsoft's greenhouse gas inventory. Secondly, are investors. Both activist investors like Engine No. 1 and major asset managers like BlackRock are beginning to prioritize decarbonization and the transition to a low carbon economy within their portfolio and their investments. Finally, we have the regulatory front. A number of different jurisdictions around the world have started to discuss or to introduce regulations based on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. So, for example, in the US, the SEC put forward a climate-related disclosure proposal in March of this year. In the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, was adopted by the European Parliament in November. And in the UK, the climate-related financial disclosure regulations came into effect in April of this year as part of the Companies Act. Zooming out, this map shows really the magnitude of mandatory TCFD-based disclosure around the world. So countries in green have already adopted TCFD requirements. Countries in blue have pending TCFD requirements, and some other countries are in the exploratory phase. Now, while this is the current state of climate-based disclosure, it's a topic that's continuously evolving. And our recommendation is that companies around the world should be preparing to respond, as we do expect that these requirements are only going to become more prevalent over time in different jurisdictions. Now, why does this matter for your company? Some of the regulations that we could see in coming years would not only require disclosures about your targets and your progress towards those targets, but also information about your decarbonization strategy itself. So this is really moving from the what and the when of decarbonization to the how. For example, language from the proposed SEC rule states, if the registrant has publicly set climate-related targets or goals, the proposed SEC rules would require information about how the registrant intends to meet its climate-related targets or goals. Now, beyond complying with regulators or responding to pressures from investors or the market, decarbonization planning is really in your company's best interest. It can help streamline operations by identifying inefficiencies, manage and mitigate risk, or attract new customers by gaining access to new markets. It's ultimately one of the best ways to build business resilience today. Now with that, I'll move into talking about the process. How can we actually begin engaging in our decarbonization strategy planning? Here are some of the high-level steps used to develop emission reduction strategies at ADEC ESG. So the first step would be an analysis of key emission sources. So it would be important to do a full greenhouse gas emission inventory, really understand where your emissions are coming from across scope 1, 2, 3, the specific activities that are contributing to those sources, and your level of influence to change or to mitigate those sources as a company. Next, we'd move into the strategy identification phase. Now that you understand the sources of your emissions, researching some of the strategies that might be able to mitigate some of the emissions here. It is important to do some contextual analysis, look at political, regulatory, technological, regional constraints that might influence the strategies that you use. From that, you can identify some of the key potential strategies that your company might be able to employ. From there, we would move into a strategy prioritization exercise. We can conduct an analysis of emission reduction potential. So for example, if I deploy strategy A, what is the emission reduction potential, X percentage of this source of my emissions? We can also conduct a feasibility review. How feasible would it be to deploy these strategies? Look at the cost analysis. What are the capital expenditure, the CapEx, the OpEx requirements to roll out this strategy at scale, and how might that impact the business in coming years? And then select the top strategies that you would like to prioritize. Step 4 would be to compile all of these strategies into different pathways. So what combination of strategies would get us further toward our decarbonization goal? There are multiple ways to get to the same destination. So we'd be able to then compare different pathways and identify our preferred pathway after consideration with the executive leadership team and the board. So that was the high level process, but I'll walk you through what that might look like in a little more detail. So this is our sample company, and this sample company is starting with step 1. They have done their greenhouse gas inventory, and they have identified their key emission sources. So for this company, they did a baseline of 2021. They see that the vast majority of their emissions come from scope 3, and specifically upstream transport and purchased goods and services within scope 3. Scope 3 it's not uncommon for scope 3 to be a significant portion of your emissions, but the actual weighting will vary from company to company depending on the industry. The company has about 9% of their 2021 emissions coming from scope 2, which is the electricity for their facilities, and then only about 2% of their emissions, so a very small proportion coming from scope 1, which is natural gas in their buildings, petrol for their vehicle fleet, and refrigerant leaks in their building. So now that they have identified their key emission sources, they have their baseline emissions at year 0. And we can begin to forecast the emissions that they would generate over time. So if the company were to continue on its current path without making any changes at all to their business, this is a typical company trajectory that you might see for their emissions over their years, expressed as tons carbon dioxide equivalent. The dotted red line in this graphic demonstrates what we call the business as usual pathways. So no changes have been made. Now here we see the trajectory if the company were to start working towards decarbonization. So they may have discussed that they want to establish an emission reduction target, which is ideally aligned with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. This could take many forms, like a science-based target or SBT. So with this target in mind, the company will begin to work to reduce its emissions with the dotted green line representing the 1.5 degree emission pathway. So they need to figure out how they're going to get from the business as usual scenario to their 1.5 degree emission pathway. Now, if we assume the company uses various mitigation strategies to aggressively reduce its emissions along its 1.5 degree emission pathway, then the company could expect to achieve an interim target 5 to 10 years into the future of possibly 40 to 50% emission reduction from its base year. The interim emission mitigation is represented by the yellow dot. As the company continues along this pathway and engages in further emission mitigation, there will come a time when the vast majority of the company's emissions, typically over 90%, have been reduced, but there's still a small amount remaining, or what we call residual emissions. So in the final year on the graph, which should be 2050 at the latest, according to the deadline set by the Paris Agreement, the company would have to remove emissions from the atmosphere, represented in the light green. So this could be emission removals, or what I spoke about, carbon offsets earlier. They would have to remove them in an amount that is equal to or greater than the amount of residual emissions, represented in dark blue, in order to achieve net zero, represented by the purple dot. So what this graph really highlights for our sample company is the difference between interim targets and net zero targets, and the role of emission mitigation versus emission removal in the decarbonization process. But how do we get from that business as usual scenario to net zero? So let's go back a little bit. The company might, after they've identified their key emission sources, the company might look at strategy identification that matches each of those sources. So for example, for their electricity in scope 2, one of the potential strategies could be renewable electricity that they would deploy in order to reach their interim target or their net zero target. Now, as I mentioned, there are a combination of different strategies that could help the company reach the eventual destination of net zero. And these can be grouped together into different reduction pathways. The executive leadership team and the board could look at these different pathways. Here we have pathways A, B, and C, and determine the preferred pathway for the company given its context. In pathway A, in the top right, we have the company matching the annual emissions target. So every year they are meeting the 1.5 degree emission pathway. So really showing that steady year-on-year progress. In company B, this shows a pathway of slower implementation. So perhaps they are going to invest less in the immediate few years, but in later years, they will invest significantly and engage in very real business model transformation in order to reach their end goal. In pathway C, the company perhaps has decided to invest very early on, very heavily in renewables, and will eventually be able to see the ROI on those renewables over time. So in our example, the sample company, the board and executive leadership team determined that the preferred pathway was pathway C. So just breaking down what those emission mitigation strategies could look like. Of course, this is different for every company, but in this example, the pathway that the company has chosen to get from their business as usual scenario to their target would be a combination of heat pumps, renewable energy, cooling upgrades, lighting upgrades, and building energy management, with the bulk of their attention and resources being focused on renewable energy. Now, the next steps going into the implementation phase would be to develop or actually commit to these targets. So now that the company has established that it is achievable, they can publicly commit to science-based targets, make a net zero commitment. They can define their near-term implementation projects, what they will focus on in the next 2 to 3 year, 3 to 5 year timeframe, and then finally the long-term change management framework. What is the strategy that would be required? What are the structures, systems, and processes, the culture, the skill set that would be necessary in order to reach that long-term target? I know today we talked a lot about the decarbonization process, which the emissions very neatly fall into the E, the environmental category of ESG. But in your next steps, it would be crucial to really think about integrating decarbonization into your business more broadly. There are a number of synergies across different topics in ESG. So although we're talking about emissions in E, when you are working on a decarbonization plan and engaging with suppliers, that falls very nicely with supply chain responsibility, getting a sense of the labor conditions within your supply chain with your suppliers and vendors in the S, or the social side of things. Under governance, this process has a lot of synergies with data management, compliance, transparency. So really you can take advantage of some of the synergies and the overlap between the different topics. You also want to think about being able to report on your progress. So as I had mentioned, publishing annual company-led ESG reports, sharing about where you are in that journey and where you still have to go, and then external reporting, for example, to CDP every year. And finally, thinking about embedding your ESG strategy into your broader operations. So that could include the principles of project and program management, assigning staff and resourcing, looking at a project management plan, establishing a risk register and a response plan so we can mitigate against any external disruptions that may come up in the process and keep our ESG strategy on track. And really identifying and leveraging the opportunities, looking at what might be possible with this business model transformation. How can we access new markets or attract talent or build our brand reputation in the market against our competitors? So it's really, you know, although our topic today was quite specific, what I would like to leave you with is taking this holistic look at ESG topics and thinking more broadly about how they can be embedded into your company in the long term. So I want to thank you very much on behalf of the ADEC ESG team. My contact information is here if you would like to follow up and learn more about the services we provide at ADEC ESG, or if you have any further questions.